This is a video tour of a sentence diagramming template for PowerPoint for people who are not greatly experienced using PowerPoint. If you happen to be watching this video without yet having the file and you wonder how to get the file, you can get it from my website ntgreekguy.com, and there's a separate video, part 1 in this series of videos on using the template that you can view for details on getting the file. Once you've downloaded the file and have saved it to a location where you'll know where to find it in the future, you can either set this up as a PowerPoint template if you know how to do that. I haven't done that because I wanted to keep things simple here. Or just open the file and save it under another file name before you begin to diagram in it so that you can leave the original copy undisturbed. Let me give you the basic idea of how you'll use this template. You can see that over on the right-hand side of the screen you have lots of diagramming symbols. You'll be dragging those out onto the canvas area on the left side of the screen and arranging them in relation to one another and substituting in place of the descriptions of the kind of material that goes in each slot, the actual Greek words that will go there. Let me call your attention to the top of the page where we have a text box that says the final 2 slides in the file provide help for using it. Just delete this text box note when you no longer need it. So let's look at the last 2 slides in the file. Slide number 6 has some significant written instructions, and I have allowed white space in the center of the slide for you to be able to drag some diagramming objects out and practice with them as you're looking at the instructions. Slide number 7 is what I call the reference slide. It's the same content as all the other slides, but it has numbers referring to specific diagramming symbols or groups of symbols. Once I've completed the setup of this file, these numbers will be hyperlinks that you can click on to open a video to the exact point in the video where these objects or groups of similar objects will be described at some length. The other slides, we looked at slide 1 and then 6 and 7. Slides 2, 3, 4, and 5 are just duplicates of slide number 1 so that you can do several pages of diagramming in this file. Let's go back to slide number 1 again. And now that we know what that text box is for at the top of the page, we can go ahead and delete that. Since this presentation is for people who do not have a lot of experience with PowerPoint, I want to spend a little time talking about the PowerPoint shapes, the various drawing objects that are here, and how you can use them and manipulate them to get what you want on the screen. So I won't be dealing with sentence diagram symbols as we do this. This is just a basic orientation to PowerPoint functionality. Obviously, sentence diagrams have a lot of lines. So I've clicked the line shape at the top of the screen, and I'm clicking now and dragging my mouse, and you can see that that line starts from the anchor point where I first clicked, and it goes to the present position of my mouse, whatever angle that might be. Now I can hold down the Shift key when I drag, and now you see my cursor is moving away from the line. The line is staying horizontal. With the Shift key down, that line is constrained to basic angles. So there's horizontal, there's 45 degrees, and there's vertical. So that's a useful function, constraining lines to particular angles. So let's just leave a line here. Now you notice that that's a thin blue line compared to the thicker black lines that I have in the diagramming symbols. I can set the properties of that line by choosing the Shape Outline command. I'll choose a black color, and then I will choose a weight of 1 point. That's 1/72 of an inch. And now my line looks like the diagramming symbols in the file because this is the weight and color that I've used for those symbols. Now if I draw another line, it's going to be in the original thin blue style. If I select the first line that I drew and click on the Format Painter, the little paintbrush up here in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, and then click on this line, it will match the one whose format I copied by clicking on that paintbrush. Notice that you can choose dotted lines, dashed lines, all different kinds of dash patterns here. The basic ones I use in the diagramming template are this square dot line and the straight line. Another diagramming symbol that you might think would be useful is this freeform tool. Here I'm going to click, and I'm not dragging with my mouse now, I'm just moving the mouse without dragging, and I will click again, and now I'll drag in a different direction, and then I'll double click to finish that shape. You can see a useful diagramming shape here. But when it comes time to resize this, that becomes difficult because if I need to make it longer, you see the angle of that more or less vertical line changing. It would be nice to maintain the same angle on all these kinds of symbols throughout the whole sentence diagram rather than having so many different angles. I can do that by right-clicking on this symbol and choosing Edit Points. Now I can make this line as long as I want it. But it's not that easy to keep exactly the same angle. If you're off a little bit, it wouldn't really make very much difference. But when it comes to resizing that horizontal line, things get a little more difficult. I've found that it is sometimes difficult to get that exactly horizontal. It looks like it should be easy, but in my experience, it's not quite as easy as it looks. So I really have not used that freeform symbol in drawing the sentence diagram symbols that you'll be using off of this palette. Instead, what I have done is I have drawn two separate lines. So let's take this line as one of them, and then we will draw another line at the angle we might want. And then I will do the format paint operation so that they are alike. Now I will align these lines with the align command so that the left sides match up. And then I will align them so that the bottoms match up. And now they're in exactly the right arrangement. They're two separate lines though. If I want them to function as one object, I'll have to select them both by dragging the selection rectangle that you saw right here, and then choosing the group command. Now I have these as one object that I can drag around as I may wish. But I can still edit the individual lines. So I can take this line and make it shorter or longer as I may wish. Same with the horizontal line, shorter or longer as I may wish. These diagram symbols that you're looking at over here in the palette are mostly built from PowerPoint groups. So they can be moved around as though they are units, and yet the individual parts can also be edited. Now obviously sentence diagrams have to have a lot of text, and so we'll click on the text box symbol, and then we'll click out here, and you can type text to your heart's content. That's probably too large a size. How would we change the size? Well, we can select the text we've typed and change the size the normal way, or you can select the whole text box rather than the text. What I just did, you notice my flashing cursor right now. I'm going to press the escape key. I just did that. The cursor no longer flashes. Now that text box is selected, and I could drag it around, put it various places on the page. While it's selected, I could also change the size, and that will change the size of all the text that's in the box. You can drag it around as I just did. You can even put it on top of other things. But you notice that's not very readable if I have a line going through the middle of it. And yet at times in sentence diagramming you do need a line that goes through some text. So let's notice what we can do with the fill. I'm going to choose the white color, and that allows the line to break and the text to be very readable. Perhaps you'd like to see some hint of that line behind the text. So let me show you what we can do with that. We can go again to Shape Fill, this time choose More Colors, and if we move our transparency figure to about 20%, then you can see a faint line behind that text. To my way of thinking, that looks fairly attractive. And so that's what I've done, for example, on this conjunction symbol here on the diagramming palette. While we're speaking of text, I should mention that it is important what Greek font you use for diagramming New Testament Greek. Not all Greek fonts have the whole range of characters with all the diacritical marks that most New Testament texts use. And so if you try to use a font in PowerPoint that does not contain all of those characters, what Windows will do, and I would imagine the Macintosh will do the same thing, is substitute another font in place of the one that you have chosen just for those characters. And so you'll get an inconsistency in the appearance of the characters depending on how closely the font that substitutes might match with the one that you've chosen. So that's a detail to watch closely and make sure that you're using a font that really works well for New Testament text. The key language to know here is Unicode, monotonic and polytonic. This video cannot go into a discussion of those things, but you can Google around for help. You want a polytonic Unicode Greek font for best results in your diagramming. If your computer system has a font that is a dedicated Greek font, that no matter what you type, it's always going to be in Greek in that font. You could also use that font for your diagramming text boxes. Now, we talked about selecting text in these text boxes compared to selecting the text box itself. There's an application of that issue when it comes to moving around groups of objects that you have created. If I want to select this whole little diagramming set here, if I click somewhere in the text and then try to drag, all I'm doing is selecting that text. I'm not dragging my diagramming object anywhere. So what you'll want to do when you're trying to move these objects around the page is be sure to click on one of the lines. If you click on one of the lines, then you can drag that whole thing as you may wish. Now, notice that the modifier didn't drag with it. That was a separate object. When I moved it up into position here, it didn't lock in and become part of that group. If I want it to become part of the group, I'll need to select it all and then hit Control-G for Windows. I believe the Macintosh equivalent is Command-Option-G. And now all of that is one group that can move together. And you can have groups inside groups. I would recommend not getting too many layers of groups inside groups. But you can a number of objects and then drag them into connection with yet another object and then group all of that together and do that several layers deep. And that will really help you as you're diagramming, because then you can move larger portions of the diagram around without having to rebuild all the little details of their interrelationships. Now let me mention the margin boxes that are here. I gave you a narrower margin box of 1/2 inch in relation to a letter size page, so that you have a guide in case you're diagramming for letter size printing or presentation. You can have a guide that lets you know the boundaries you need to stay within. If you're not so pressed for space, you might want to use 1-inch margins. As you begin to draw diagrams, you will probably want to delete one or maybe even both of these margin boxes. And then I've also given you a text box here where you can triple click to select the whole paragraph and then paste Greek text from some Bible software program you may be using or text that you have typed out, so that you have the text of the passage right before you as you diagram. Then you can copy and paste words from this text box down into the diagramming symbols where they belong. A separate video will cover that kind of information. And we'll also do just a little bit of diagramming in this video later on. Now let's go back to slide 6 and look at some of the points in the instructions that I've provided here. I'm going to come over to the palette and click on one of my diagram objects, and I'm going to hold the Control key down while I drag this out into the middle of the slide. By holding the Control key down, I drag a copy of the object instead of the object itself. And then if later in the diagram I need another one of those, which is likely to be the case, then it's still there ready for me to drag out a fresh copy when the time comes. If I try to bring out another diagramming object, such as this modifier symbol, with my Control key, notice what's happening. I'm bringing the modifier out, but the object that I had brought out previously is also moving to the left. So something's wrong here. What happened? I'm going to hit undo, and what happened is I had failed to unselect this baseline object that I had previously brought out. So you'll want to get in the habit, whenever you bring something out onto the canvas and you plop it where you want it, you'll want to click somewhere else so that you unselect that before you bring another object out. Now I can bring out a modifier object and put it in position where I want it. As far as positioning objects goes, I've built this file with a 1/20th of an inch grid, and I've made the diagramming objects in multiples of 1/20th of an inch for the most part. So most of the time when you bring out a diagramming object, you'll find that it will naturally align to objects that you've already put out on the canvas. Sometimes you do need to nudge things a little bit up or down, or maybe even left or right. You can hold down the Control key while bumping the arrow key to move things in very small increments. If you use up or down without holding the Control key, things will move in those 1/20th of an inch increments that I talked about. We've now covered most of what's in the first 4 bullet points in the instruction list, either just now or in previous discussion. I do want to call attention to how you select symbols from inside groups. So if you're selecting a text box, we've already talked about that. You can click in the text box if you want to edit the text. But if you want to move the text box, then you need to hit the Escape key to get out of text editing mode and have the text box selected. What about lines? Well, once you have a group selected, you can select a line by clicking directly on it. I've just clicked on this vertical line, which I can now move to the left or right as I may need to. If you haven't already selected a group, you can triple click directly on a line and the group will be selected and then the line will be selected after that. Now a very important point is over here in the next bullet, changing the length of an angled line while maintaining its angle. So let's bring an object out here and I can illustrate what I mean. If I need this object to be taller vertically, I can do that by dragging that little resize box right here in the center. But you notice that when I do that, the angle of my line changes. It's more nearly vertical here, and it moves toward the horizontal as the box gets shorter and shorter. That's not really what we want. We would like to be able to maintain the same angle at all times, regardless of the height of the symbol. So let me undo to restore the original and show you the better way to do this. If you click on this line, once the group is selected, select just that angled line within the group, hold down Control and Shift, and then you can resize this as you may need to, and it will stay constrained to its original angle. That's very helpful. We don't need that box anymore, so let's delete that now. This dotted curve symbol is a tricky one. Let's bring it out. It's not very useful as it is. You would almost certainly have to resize it. I'm going to right-click on it and choose Edit Points and show you how you can change the shape of this curve to make it pretty much any shape you need. I'm going to click on the end point here, the lower end point, and drag it up here. And you may say that doesn't look very satisfying because that's not much of a curve at the bottom. It looks like a pretty sharp point to me. And of course you would be ever so right. If we click on that point, watch what happens if we drag this little node around. On one side of that point, the curve is reforming and the shape of the curve is changing according to how far out I pull this, how far in, how far down, how far up. But it's still a sharp corner. The other side didn't change at all. Look what happens though if I hold the Shift key while I drag that little node. Now it's not a sharp corner anymore. Now it's forming as a curve. And you can drag other points and get a curve in pretty much any shape you want. You can add points and edit points, delete points, reform the curve. Pretty much any shape you need you can get. Okay, let's delete that since we don't need that anymore. Now most of the rest of the instructions here are things that we've already covered. There is an issue here about converting your finished diagrams to a letter-sized document, but there's a separate video on how to do that. Now it's worth mentioning that the symbols I provided here really are starting points. You're welcome to modify them as necessary. You're the one in control. I'm just giving you a tool to work with. Now let's go back to the first slide and actually draw a short sentence diagram. Let's begin by selecting all of these diagram objects and deleting them. Then we'll triple click, and I have some text on my clipboard that I'll paste here. As you can see, it's much too big as it was before, so I'll press Escape and then set that in 11-point font. And we don't need the parenthetical reference, so we will delete it. The text reads, "He called his name Jesus." This is from the end of Matthew chapter 1. I have an understood subject, a verb, and a direct object, so I'll need a full baseline with subject, verb, and object for this diagram. So I'll control-click to drag this out onto the screen, and as I described earlier, I'll hit the up and down arrow a couple times to get this in a good position. And then I will double-click the subject box and type in the parenthetical capital X that is usually used for an elliptical subject. Now I'll come up here and select the verb, and I'm pressing Control-C to copy it. But before I do anything else, I'm going to set it to a gray color. And the reason I do this is that sometimes I'm doing very complicated diagrams with quite a bit of text, and it's very useful to know which words I've already put into my diagram and which ones I have not. So if every time I copy a word to move it down into the diagram, I will turn it gray, I'll be able to keep track of where I am. So the verb is in its place now, and we need the direct object, ta onoma. So I'll select those words, copy, turn them gray, select object, and paste. And then we have a modifier for onoma, the possessive pronoun autu, so we'll bring a simple modifier symbol up here, and we'll put it close to where it's supposed to go. I'll use the arrow key to bring it right up into position. And then the word out to will go on that modifier shelf. Now we just have one word left, but how does it function? It's a predicate accusative, and it belongs on the baseline, but we don't have any space on the baseline for it. There are no more slots for that kind of a word. Well, we'll have to make our own. We need an angled symbol like this, so I'll come over here and control drag one of these out and put it into somewhere near its proper position. But obviously my baseline needs to be longer to host another word after that angled line. How am I going to do this? Well, we can, if we wish, lengthen that baseline, as I described earlier in this video. But here, what I'm noticing is that there's a lot of extra space over on the left-hand side, and so I would rather use that space. I'm going to select this text box, the subject-predicate divider, the verb box, the object box, and that line between the verb and the object. Let's get that too. And I'm going to just use my arrow keys to move these things to the left. I have the subject pretty well where I want it now, so I will shift-click to unselect the subject while leaving everything else selected, and then I will move these other items onto the left as well. I like where the subject-predicate divider is now, so I'll shift-click to unselect it. I will move the rest of it over a few notches. I'll shift-click to unselect the verb, and I'll move the direct object divider over a few notches, and carefully shift-click to unselect it. The object is actually too close to it for clear readability, so I will move it over to the right a little bit, just to give a more pleasing spacing. And then this modifier out to, I'm holding the shift key down as I drag this over, and that constrains the drag to exactly horizontal. And now I can bring this divider down to the baseline where it needs to be, and bring yay soon down into its proper slot. But you say, I don't see a text box there. How do I get yay soon to sit on that baseline? Well, there are two ways you could do this. You could click the text box for Anima, move the cursor to the end of the text, paste in the word yay soon, then add some spaces to put it over as far to the right as you want it. Another way you can do this is using the text box I provided as a diagramming symbol. I'll do control drag and bring this text box out into position. And then I can copy, and there's probably not any point in turning it gray since it's the last word of the sentence, but let's do it anyway just for consistency, and paste it into its position. Now it looks like it needs to come back to the left a little bit too, doesn't it? So let's do that. And instead of having to lengthen our baseline, now we can actually shorten the baseline and make our sentence diagram considerably more compact. Okay, here's a very simple diagramming exercise. There's a separate video in which I diagram a much more complicated sentence and deal with a lot of other little details along the way. So I encourage you to watch that video for more detail. Happy diagramming!